Welcome back to the Fox Den, everyone, a podcast series from West Shore Community College. We are reviewing the winter 2023 book of the semester, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This episode covers the final chapters of the book, 25 through 30, where we chat about character development with librarian Patty Skinner, biology and evolution with Professor Paul Belinsky, and science fiction appreciation with Executive Director of College Relations, Crystal Young. Hello, I'm Wade James, Professor of Mathematics, and I'm hoping to have one Hail Mary of a spring break.
Hi, I'm Patty Skinner, Director of Library Services, and I'm not cut out for the space travel diet.
Hi, I'm Paul Belinsky, Professor of Biology, and I think innovation is inevitable.
Hi, I'm Crystal Young. I'm Executive Director of College Relations, and I used to take little glow-in-the-dark stars and form the constellations on the ceiling of my bedroom.
In Chapter 25, the Hail Mary successfully returns to the Blip A, during which time Ryland has selectively bred nitrogen-resistant Taumoeba. The achievement is bittersweet, as both Ryland and Rocky prepare to leave for their homeworlds.
In Chapter 26, Ryland has been piloting the Hail Mary toward Earth for a month, during which time he constructs plans for delivering Taumoeba to Venus, confronting Strat, and entering sleep coma for the remainder of the trip. However, during a routine check of the fuel tanks, Ryland discovers the astrophage has been infected with Taumoeba.
In Chapter 27, Ryland conducts a battery of experiments to determine how Taumoeba infected the astrophage tanks. If he cannot determine the source of the Taumoeba infection, the mission to save Earth will be jeopardized.
In Chapter 28, Ryland concludes that selective breeding of nitrogen-resistant Taumoeba had an unintended consequence. The Taumoeba also learned to tunnel through xenonite. Panic strikes, as Ryland recalls that Rocky's ship is composed of xenonite, and Taumoeba have likely infected all his fuel tanks.
In Chapter 29, Ryland launches the non-xenonite beetles towards Earth, containing nitrogen-resistant Taumoeba and instructions for deployment to Venus. He then reverses course and treks back to Tau Ceti, hoping to locate the disabled Blip A and help his friend return home.
In Chapter 30, several years have passed, and Ryland has been living on Rocky's homeworld of Arid in a life support dome. Rocky reports that Earth's sun has returned to full luminosity, confirming to Ryland that the beetles reached Earth and his efforts to save the planet were successful. Ryland pauses briefly to consider returning to Earth, then proceeds to teach science to a class of middle school Iridians.
This is Crystal's first time on the podcast, so I think what we should do is give her a warm Fox Den welcome. Yep.
That was an amazing welcome.
So in Chapter 25, Ryland and Rocky are heading back to the Blip A. They've discovered that nitrogen kills Taumoeba. And so what they need to do is selectively breed Taumoeba to be nitrogen resistant at a 3% level so they can survive at Venus, and then at an 8% level so they can survive on Rocky's system's planet called Three World. So Paul, tell us about this selective breeding of astrophage.
I was incredibly excited to see the inclusion of experimental evolution in the book. Biology presented the central problem for this book through the existence of astrophage, and now biology is presenting the solution through the existence of Taumoeba. And humans/Iridians are only along for the ride to facilitate the speed with which biology solves its own problems. So like the other topics that I talked about, hibernation and panspermia, the author's actually just copying what already existing science does and making it seem more sci-fi. Wade's summary of the situation is pretty on point. Ryland finds a predator for astrophage, an amoeba that's going to eat it, but it's natively adapted to a different ecology. Ryland's goal is to get it to be better suited and locally adapted to two different planets, the Three World and Venus, right? So how's he going to go through that? Experimental evolution. He identifies those conditions that optimize for Taumoeba to live on these different planets and has Rocky build experimental chambers that are slowly going to be able to allow Talmiba to adapt to these different ecologies. If you go from low nitrogen to high nitrogen, that would potentially cause catastrophic failure of a lot of the cellular components. But if you inch your way towards it, you allow for natural genetic diversity to select for adaptation and survival in different climates. It's a pretty neat solution. Have we as scientists done anything similar? Well, you guessed it, we most certainly have, and then some. Experimental evolution is actually a pretty well-developed field in the world of bacteria. We have numerous long-term evolution experiments, or LTEEs, running across the world. For example, one in our own state, Michigan, where a group started with 12 populations of E. coli in 1988 and has been tracking their evolution ever since. So that's 37 years of evolution in controlled environments to see how natural selection might be repeating itself.
I think that was done at Michigan State University, right?
Yeah, definitely. MSU is where this particular one was done. And it was actually my first exposure to experimental evolution. A professor came to UC San Diego and gave a talk, so we got to see what exactly was going on. Across these many experiments, the 12 different subpopulations, we see bacteria shift to surviving in new ecological conditions, just like what Ryland was doing with Talmiba. But we saw something even cooler, where experimental evolution was able to drive the creation of an entirely new digestive system in these E. coli. So what this group at MSU did was they had E. coli in its typical sugar source, glucose, but they also added a sugar that it is categorically never been able to digest, something called citrate. After many generations, the scientists saw that different subpopulations of E. coli, at the time that I saw the talk, it was 2, had evolved enzymes necessary to start making energy from citrate, meaning that E. coli evolved a new method of digesting something that it previously never recognized as food. Think about how amazing that is. Bacteria coexists with a useless energy source for a long time, until that bacteria evolves the molecular machinery to tap into that as a useful energy source. It's kind of like humans living in the woods for a while and eventually evolving the digestive machinery to extract calories from wood. So it's certainly within the wheelhouse of believable that Ryland would be able to slowly push Talmiba to adapt in different ecologies. It's a really cool example of experimental evolution in the wild, and the science is crazier than the science fiction here. I really enjoyed how this book was able to tie modern cutting edge science into problem solving within different solar systems. I thought that was pretty neat.
What did you think about the timeline of the experiment?
It's X amount of iterations of a generation, right? So how many times you're able to reproduce determines how many times you're able to go through that naturally selective process, because every generation you accumulate new mutations. Mutations are a feature of biology, not a flaw. Genetic diversity is how we survive through changing ecology. And so if for some reason, the author could, science fiction, you could say Talmiba goes through a generation in 3 minutes, which is much faster than E. coli will. And all of a sudden you could very easily imagine that all of this could occur in a month, whereas in E. coli, for the evolution on citrate, I think the first instance happened after 8 years and the next one happened after 12. Mutation's a random force. It's not like this is going to always happen, but it is possible to happen. And if Ryland is really like cranking up the amount of nitrogen, really pushing it to the limit, you'll have a stronger selective force to potentially expedite the process.
Just as they arrive at the blip A, they reach the 8.25% nitrogen resistance in the Talmiba. This is great, but again, it's bittersweet because now the two buddies realize we've got our solution and now we have to part ways and we have to leave. Ryland heads back towards Earth. Rocky heads back towards his homeworld. And during this time, Ryland has some flashbacks about his relationship with Strat and how she kind of put him into this awkward position.
What do you guys think happened to Strat after launch?
I kind of think the launch wasn't the end of it for her. Like that was the beginning of the mission, really. Like Strat was probably anxiously awaiting next steps and seeing if her master plan would come to fruition. I really think that this chapter makes Strat out to be the villain of this story. She's just out to serve this end mission and will take any means necessary and doesn't really take ethics into consideration. And I think those are really villainous characteristics.
My guess is she was probably court-martialed and is sitting in prison despite her best efforts to try to save the world. No good deed goes unpunished.
Yes, she was a villain, but villain to like individual people, but this was a species trying to survive. So maybe I sympathize a little bit more with her in that she's deciding how to save the patient by hacking away limbs. And ultimately, the mission was a high point of something where we were trying to give humanity hope. And now it's how to not die before the mission solves our problems and how to not prevent ourselves from killing ourselves. So I'd imagine that Strat, she would still be useful to them because she does that very well.
Yeah, I really like that the book left this open to interpretation because they don't resolve it. They don't actually tell you what. We know that the sun regained its luminosity, and so therefore Ryland's mission was fulfilled. But you never know like how many people perished, what governments took advantage of the situation. And to some extent, that's a good move by the author because it creates a reflection of who you are as to what you think happened to the earth. So if you're a very pessimistic person, you probably are going to think the countries all turned against each other, war and famine and all these bad things. If you're an optimistic person, you may be thinking, well, of course we all got along and everyone worked together to save each other. I thought that was a very clever way that the author leave the issue of earth unresolved.
Maybe I'm optimistic as it turns out. I just imagine people kind of biding their time and waiting to see if this mission was able to be completed. And I kind of don't imagine Strat ending up in jail. I think she would go out in a blaze of glory before she would submit to that.
I think I disagree with you on both accounts. I think if Strat was sent to jail, she would abide because, this is humanity judging itself. And I actually think that we probably would tear ourselves to shreds, and it'd be an incredibly small fraction of us who would survive in a starved planet. Having studied past extinction events on our planet, that seems to be the way things go, that scarcity of resources is the fundamental cause of war. And we're looking at the biggest scarcity of resources since the asteroid hit our planet 65 million years ago.
Ryland discovers that Talmiba has infected the astrophage tanks. He is baffled by this. He doesn't understand how the Talmiba could have escaped the experimental farms that were made out of xenonite that throughout the whole entire story proclaimed as this magical material that is extremely rigid and strong and can do all these amazing things. And so he begins a process of eliminating variables to try to figure out how the Talmiba have escaped the farms.
Biology always has unintended consequences. Many a times there's plenty of cool ecology stories wherein we introduce a predator to deal with an invasive species only to bungle the situation. And now we have two invasive species. Hawaii is one of the worst stories regarding this. There were snakes that came in on boats unintentionally that were eating a lot of native Hawaiian birds. So biologists looked for what could potentially be predators for the snakes. And we introduced mongoose, only to realize that the mongoose and the snakes hunted at different times of the day. And therefore, now we're both hunting the baby birds. So we introduced something to make our situation worse. It's not exactly what Ryland is seeing with the infection of the tanks, but biology has a way of escaping our intended goals of it at times.
This evolution of nitrogen-resistant Talmiba had an unintended consequence, which was that he inadvertently bred Talmiba to tunnel within xenonite. And so that's how they were able to get out of the xenonite boxes. Another theme that is constantly run through here, and the duality of characters in this book, right? So we talked about how Astrophage originally was the villain, but then Astrophage is now somewhat the hero because it propels the ship, it protects the passengers from radiation. We talked about Talmiba. It's good because it eats Astrophage, and now it's evil because it eats Astrophage. And here again, with regard to that selective evolution, where it's great because now we've bred something that is nitrogen resistant and yay, we can deploy it on the planets. But then, oops, we accidentally made it so that way it can go through xenonite too. And so once again, we have this duality of something that is sort of first presented as a solution, and then it turns out that there's an unintended consequence that causes conflict in the storyline. He's panic-stricken because he realizes that Rocky's ship is completely composed of xenonite. And so all of the Taumiba on Rocky's ship have probably already tunneled through their xenonite cages. They're already infecting his fuel supply. So not only does it impact his fuel supply, but it also affects his protection from radiation. Ryland takes the 4 beetles, which are not made with xenonite. He launches those towards Earth. He does a U-turn and hightails it back to the Blip A in order to find his friend.
You guys thought that this was a book about science, but actually this is a book about friendship the whole time. This is really about Rocky and Ryland's friendship, and they became so close through their working together to save their species that they really came to value one another in that relationship kind of above all. So I think at the end of the day, this is just a book about 2 best friends.
And therefore ultimately a book about science, because fundamentally these are 2 species. And what we see repeatedly, particularly on our planet, is how collaboration between species allows for the success of both of them. We see this in our forests with fungi and plants. Fungi actually do most of the drinking of water for plants, but plants are really good at making sugar. So you've got mycorrhizal species, and by working together, they're better than any of the species that operate alone. And I think, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm picking a fight with you, Patty, but I think that ultimately it is kind of a metaphor for how collaboration, even between species, is ultimately better for them both. And how honestly, the more we study our world, it's not a zero-sum game. It is not the situation where only the fittest survive. Even in agriculture, where the background that I come from, the most productive corn is the most collaborative corn nowadays. It's different than what we thought it was before.
I absolutely love that. So I was really fascinated with this part of the book where it's like, wow, what a decision point for him to either return to Earth and his family and make sure Earth is okay, or let me see if I can do both and make that really, really difficult decision. Paul, what you just said about collaboration, I think in just the past 10, 20 years, people have started to realize like what is good for you is good for me and what is bad for you is bad for me. And it's taken a long time to get to that point. And I think we still have to get a lot of people on board, but recognizing it's not I have, you have, it's we. And how do we really help people understand that collaborative nature is going to be what saves all of us in the end?
Ryland reverses course through a series of pinging radars. He finds the Blip A, which is disabled. Ryland gets in the EVA suit, attaches to the Blip A. He knocks on the hull, and Rocky hears him.
My wife and I definitely paused the book. We're like, man, how cool would that feel? Rocky's thinking that he's dead. He's failed his species. And then you hear like, tap, 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 tap. Oh, yes. Oh, my God.
I thought a lot about who was the hero of the story and the hero's journey kind of throughout the story. And is Ryland's journey different, not going home? Like, how does that change the hero's journey when he encounters all these problems and he has to overcome all these obstacles to, at the end, go be celebrated somewhere other than home? And it made me think, like we were talking about earlier, was Earth worth going back to? Was humanity something that he wanted to spend more time with after the way that he left Earth? Is that something worth going back to? So I kind of spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a hero, and do you need to be celebrated back at home to be the hero of your own story?
We flash forward and we're now a number of years in the future. Ryland is living on Arid, on Rocky's homeworld, in his own atmospheric bubble, and they figured out a way to feed him, to keep him alive. Paul, tell me about me burgers.
Yes. This is super relevant now because we are every day one step closer to consuming lab-grown meat, even in the States. So it's weird to me that with the way that, the Iridian's technology, that they would be able to clone different cells from a different planet. And, so there's a little bit hazy as to like, would they have had this technology on their own? But sure, whatever, let's throw that out the window. Can we start to clone meat in order to produce protein without the animal? And yes, we are, one step closer to having lab-grown chicken sold in the States. I believe you can already buy lab-grown beef in the UK. It's a way of having cruelty-free meat because you never have to have the animal that is raised in order to produce the meat. It's also much more ecologically sustainable because when you think about it, to grow the animal, not only, does their pain and suffering count, but on top of that, they're growing bones, they're breathing, they're producing fur, and you don't eat any of that. Those are all endpoints that are useless to us as humans in terms of calories. If we instead wanted to be much more energy efficient, we would want to just produce the meat and proteins and fat that we deem tasty and consume only that. And so me burgers are a way of Ryland getting access to calories from a protein that he's familiar with, human. He's not eating any of the nervous tissue that would, potentially have other downstream effects. It's literally just a way of synthesizing cells that are similar enough to his digestive system that he can extract food from. So yeah, it's awesome. It's a little bit weird and off-putting in the sense that he's eating his own cloned flesh. We as a society will be facing a similar question about, will you be comfortable eating lab-grown meat for its ecological and animal cruelty benefits? And I want to, I'll throw that question back. Would you eat lab-grown meat?
I think that's going to be something, Paul, that it might be terrifying or gross to some of us now, but in the next 30, 40, 50 years, like our children or our children's children will have had that worked in at some point where it's normal. And so am I willing to? I will try it. Would it be my go-to right now? I am an absolute carnivore, but I absolutely appreciate the fact that we need to move that direction. In all the other space novels I read, it all talks about vat-grown meat versus any type of other, how they get their proteins. And a lot of it is from mushrooms or fungi. So I don't know if how they're growing stuff now, if they incorporate any other types of stuff to create texture or flavor or smell. I'd be game to try it.
With regard to the book, what other resources would he have had to clone? Was there anything from the Hail Mary that they were able to salvage? The jump between chapter 29 and chapter 30, chapter 29 is Ryland knocking on the Blip A's hull. Chapter 30, he's been living on Arid for a while. What happened to the Hail Mary? Could the Iridians have synthesized the food from the sleep coma or the burritos that he was able to eat? Could the Iridians have synthesized those things? So that kind of leads me to believe that something happened to the Hail Mary where those resources were not available. And the only resources that Ryland had was his own tissue for cloning purposes. The end of the book, Ryland turns to the class and says, "Who can tell me the speed of light?" That was a similar type of question that he would have asked his middle school students on Earth. And one thought that I had was, how much different would his instructional practices be teaching Iridians versus teaching students on Earth? Like, how does he do the beanbags? He still does the beanbags in class where he asks a pop question and he tosses the beanbag out to the student. Does he have like a beanbag launcher that is built in somehow that he controls in his environment that launches the beanbags out to the students in their environment? I would just really like to see his classroom setup on Arid, because he's going to find a way to mirror the things that he was doing back on Earth. And I think that would be cool.
What I knew is that you, Wade James, were going to love the end of this book. Ryland was living kind of both as like a novelty in Arid, like kind of a subject for study, and that he was fully embraced and part of the community. So I kind of liked seeing that he wasn't one or the other, that he was able to kind of be fully part of their community and have a job and be a productive member of this new society. What an interesting, like, intergalactic connection that he's made, and kind of the power of that friendship he formed.
And maybe that's something we could learn from. If the roles were reversed and Ryland brought Rocky to Earth, would Rocky be embraced in the same community status as Ryland was on Arid? When you watch sci-fi movies, what's the first thing that happens? The government's going to grab the alien, they're going to put him somewhere, isolate him, dissect him, try to figure out what's going on. Think back to E.T.
That's
right?
exactly what I was thinking about. But didn't we land on that Earth was kind of like a dumpster fire, not worth going back to?
I think so, at least. I think that in all likelihood, it's better to go back, and Earth will be in a rough situation, and kind of let them figure their things out on their own. I also think in the end, it was kind of a commentary on scientists in general, that we'd be more likely to, I don't really want to go back to Earth. I just met this alien species. This is we're chasing curiosity. We are after intellectual stimulation above all else. So it's talking about a different way of a human brain operating. And I thought that was cool, that heroics and appreciation back home doesn't matter to Ryland. What matters to him is to continue to learn about an alien. That's cool.
What did he have to go back for? It was his kids. And he still has that at the end. He still has his students.
He seems to be sort of an active member of their culture. The thought that kept popping through my head was blossom where you're planted. It doesn't matter where you are. Try to do the best you can with what you have. Don't ever give up. He's a science teacher in a middle school filled with Iridians. In some ways, you can't escape who you are, and just blossom and do the best you can wherever you land. Like, even if it's an alien world filled with alien middle schoolers, if you're a middle school science teacher, you got a job to do.
I love that blossom where you're planted. I think often humans find themselves in when I get here, this will happen, or when this time arrives, I should be. And just being in that moment and fulfilling your purpose or utilizing your talents for the good of whatever is in front of you is huge. That practice of contentment and being in that place, I think, is just a beautiful thing.
You've been listening to The Fox Den, a podcast series from West Shore Community College. This has been our final review of the Winter 2023 book of the semester, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, chapters 25 through 30. Join us this Thursday, April 6th at 3 p.m. in the West Shore Community College Library for our final live panel discussion on the book's character arcs, symbolism, and connections to other works of literature. Until then, I'm Wade James.
And I'm Patty Skinner.
And I'm Paul Belinsky.
And I'm Crystal Young. Where are you people? Come on.
I got my very own microphone.
For me to not sound dumb. I'm just, Patty, don't hate me.
I have like a sticky note.
Cage that wild stallion.
Yeah, this has been really fun.
And that's the end of the book.